Welcome to the Korea Pro podcast. I'm your host, Jeongmin Kim, the editorial director of Korea Pro.
And I'm John Lee, the editor of Korea Pro.
Join us for a weekly 15-minute conversation as we dive into the most pressing stories shaping South Korea and dissect the most complicated ones for you.
From politics to culture, technology to society, we've got you covered. So stay ahead of the curve and never be sidelined again.
So get ready for a fresh perspective on South Korea's news. This is the Korea Pro podcast.
All right, everyone, welcome back to the Korea Pro podcast. It is now Thursday, August 1st, a little before 3 p.m. Now, before we actually start to talk about the topics today, I wanted to give you guys a quick reminder that we are opening our podcast to topic suggestions. So if any of you listeners out there have any particular topic, South Korea related, that you have in mind that you would like Jeongmin and I to discuss, please send us your suggestions to podcast@koreapro.org.
Or if you have any comments, a positive one, please leave a review as well. And let's move on to the actual topics that we're going to talk about today. Let's start with econ. There were a lot of interest rate related news all over the world, basically, that relates to South Korea, sort of. Let's start with the BOJ.
Okay, the BOJ, of course, being the Bank of Japan. Now, yesterday, the Bank of Japan made a surprise announcement. Now, the BOJ had initially raised interest rates to 0.1% in March, but yesterday, they raised it to 0.25%.
This is a big deal.
Oh, yeah. Now, we have to caveat this by saying that 0.25% is still very low compared to global standards. But if you're making relative comparisons to what it was just a day ago, this is a huge spike in Japan's interest rates. And this is going to have a lot of shifts in trade and econ policies throughout Northeast Asia. But just as we thought that was going to be the big thing, the U.S. Federal Reserve also made their announcement.
Which was?
Now, Jerome Powell, he said that the U.S. is not going to change their interest rates, which is at 5.3%, so that's a huge gap with the BOJ and the Fed.
Remind us, BOJ is currently
at 0.25 and the Federal Reserve is at 5.3. And Jerome Powell said that the U.S. is not going to cut the interest rates yet, but they did hint that maybe sometime in September there might be cuts depending on what the economic numbers would be. They didn't say how much they would cut or when exactly, but they did hint that that's a possibility.
That's still new, right?
Yeah, that also happened just a few hours after the BOJ made their announcement. And so these are two conflicting information that we're hearing. Whereas the Bank of Japan is raising their rates, the Federal Reserve is saying that they might cut their rates going forward. And this will have South Korea stuck in the middle. Because what's going to happen is that if now that the BOJ has raised the interest rates, the yen has started to appreciate against the dollar. Now, what that means is that automatically the South Korean won is going to start depreciating. But if the Federal Reserve starts to cut the interest rates in September, which is about a month from now, that will cause the South Korean won to appreciate against the dollar. And so there's going to be a lot of financial volatility going forward. It's going to make South Korean exporters competitive compared to their Japanese rivals, at least for the time being. But it really depends on how much the Fed is going to cut their rates in September. It's a lot of things up in the air right now.
I see. So what would be the main dilemma for the South Korean authorities to try to figure this out?
Well, the Bank of Korea, the BOK, is in a really tough spot right now. The Trade Ministry just released the export numbers today. And the ministry said that South Korea's economy exports grew by almost 14% in July. And that
year
makes
on
it
year.
Year on year. And so that makes it the 10th consecutive month of exports going up. And so, yeah, exports are going up. The economy is healthy. But just 2 weeks ago, the South Korean GDP contracted by 0.2%. And that was because of weak domestic demand. And so the BOK is in a tough spot. On the one hand, it wants to help exporters to continue exporting more so that the South Korean economy can thrive. But on the other hand, weak domestic consumption is dragging down the Korean economy.
Right, and weak domestic consumption, this has been going on for a while.
And it's not caught up with where the exporters are. And a lot of this because of household debt. A lot of people have their money in real estate or are still struggling to pay off whatever loans they took out from financial institutions. And so the BOK is right now saying, okay, inflation is at 2.4%. It's a little higher than their 2% target rate, but it's manageable. Now we're trying to make the economy grow and we're going to try to make domestic spending go up a little bit more. But now that there's the BOJ and the Fed making their deferring movements with their interest rates, the Bank of Korea is now in a very tough spot as to what to do going forward.
Right. Just to interject with domestic politics angle here, just very briefly. What did the administration decide regarding whether or not to do the cash voucher, or the DP or whatever?
I don't think that's going anywhere at this point.
It's not going anywhere, right?
They mentioned it and they just stopped talking about it. Now, the president, we talked about this in a previous podcast episode.
Right.
The president did counter this by saying that the finance ministry is going to give out a lot of vouchers to small businesses,
right,
not to individual citizens, as the Democratic Party said. But
and DP is still holding on to that idea?
I believe so, but they've not actually made any moves right now. The Democratic Party is really busy with so many other domestic agendas, like trying to impeach the president, or at least trying to show that they're trying to impeach the president. And because of all of these distractions right now, the Democratic Party doesn't really have a lot to say about the economic trajectory.
Okay, then what about the Yoon administration's policy so far in recent weeks to boost the domestic spending?
Well, the last thing that the Yoon administration actually said was to help out these small businesses, but that's 2 weeks ago, and at this point, 2 weeks ago feels like a lifetime ago now. There's been so many other changes that has happened in the global scale that we're not quite sure if this measure alone would be sufficient. And because right now the BOK is at a loss for really how to mitigate all of this to make sure that the South Korean economy isn't overly impacted, the Bank of Korea is most likely going to say that we are going to maintain our 3.5% interest rate going forward. But the government side is saying, hey, politically, we need to help our citizens. We need fiscal stimulus. And so we've got the BOK being very dovish on one hand, and we've got the government's fiscal stimulus being hawkish on the other hand. There are lots of conflicting signals going on.
And it sounds like there are a lot of moving pieces just in the past 2 weeks so far.
Exactly.
Right. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, subscribe for Korea Pro, because we keep you updated with latest news related to all these really difficult stuff from the econ new point of view. And moving on, while we are on the subject about Japan, there were some foreign policy related topics related to Japan this week as well. Let's start with the memorandum, the security cooperation memorandum. This one is trilateral, I believe.
It was over the weekend. The Defense Department published their I want to say press briefing, where they it wasn't anything particularly new. They did say that they were going to re-emphasize their commitments to this trilateral cooperation. But what did stick out was what they said in the document. They said that this trilateral cooperation will, of course, maintain peace in the Korean Peninsula, but that's what they always say. But there were two other things. And also regarding the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. Yeah. What does that mean? Indo-Pacific region, of course, that's easy to guess as to what that might be. Taiwan.
If you were a U.S. official drafting the and beyond part, what would you have been thinking about?
If I were a U.S. official, I would think, hey, why don't some of these rich East Asian allies of ours also provide some weapons to Ukraine? And so that would be the first thing that I'd be thinking of. And will there be some carrots and sticks involved with this? If Japan and South Korea starts to, I don't know, provide Patriot missiles to Ukraine, would there be something that comes back to these two countries? There's got to be a lot of negotiations that must have taken place. But beyond that document that the Defense Department had published, we don't really know the nitty-gritty details of what they might have talked about yet.
Right, and also the reporters at the Defense Ministry right immediately on Monday pushed the Defense Ministry to please explain maybe a little more about this document, but they declined, saying that we are not going to reveal the details of this document. They usually say when there are not that much significant thing in the document, they wouldn't go that far to say that we are not revealing.
Right.
So it sounds like it took a lot of effort to actually draft this document, and just domestic politics angle in the U.S. and South Korea.
And Japan.
And in Japan, actually. This is what South Korea and the U.S. and Japan has been talking about in the past year, institutionalizing the security cooperation, trilateral cooperation. And institutionalizing something like this is a cue to, even if it's like a code word to say that even if the administration changes, this stays, we hope.
Which
Fingers
is what
crossed.
the South Korean defense minister said. He said that regardless of who becomes the U.S. president, this will stay.
Or the South Korean president.
Or the South Korean
The
government.
reading between the lines.
Now, I think it was still rather overly confident thing to say because we still don't know who will be the U.S. president going forward.
It's true.
Sure, this is still, of course, a Korea Pro podcast, so we won't dive too much into U.S. politics. But there has been a lot of things have been happening within the U.S. presidential race as well. Now, Trump doesn't look as robust as he did before Biden announced his resignation, but it does not disqualify him yet. And so I was quite taken aback when Shin Won-sik, the South Korean defense minister, actually said that.
I think it's maybe, I wouldn't say wishful thinking, but I think it's more like a symbolic messaging that it should be. I think it's something normative that he was trying to say, that this should be institutionalized regardless of whoever wins the election in the U.S. While we are on Japan, there was another headline that usually gets a lot of clicks and then are forgotten in like 2 hours or so. History issues. Sado Mine. What happened?
Finally, after years of trying, Japan succeeded in getting the Sado gold mine listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
So why did the DP hate this so much?
Well, it wasn't just a DP that hated this so much. It was Koreans who hated this so much for a very long time. And it was because, sure, the Sado gold mine goes back for a long time in Japanese history, but it also involves Korean history because there were a lot of Korean forced wartime laborers who were forced to work in those mines and who died in those mines during the Second World War. And there were a lot of moves that happened in Japan where they removed any mentions of those forced laborers or they downplayed them. A very common refrain that we heard from the Japanese right-wing nationalists saying was that, yeah, it was a brutal environment for people to work in, but it wasn't just for the Koreans. It was brutal for everyone. Sure, it might have been brutal for everyone, but some people were slaves.
Right. Like they were not volunteer workers or anything.
Exactly. And so because of that, there's been a lot of pushback from Korea saying as long as Japan doesn't recognize the Korean slave labor that went into making this Sado gold mine a thing for their country, then South Korea would continue to oppose it. Until just recently, the foreign ministry said, okay, fine. We will not oppose the listing on the UNESCO World Heritage Site, provided that you being Japan will actually finally make a commitment to memorializing those Korean forced wartime laborers.
In domestic politics headline, this was framed in lines of so there were allegations by multiple progressive media outlets, exclusives, and so on and so forth, claiming that the Yoon administration knew about how the forced labor part will not be included, but still agreed. It's 이면 합의설, like they agreed behind the closed doors or something. But the South Korean administration pushed back, it seems. So this will be in the headlines for a while. It
will be in the headlines for a very long time. The Democratic Party did not mince words. They were calling Yoon a treacherous diplomat.
They said 종교적 외교.
Right.
근거 없는 종교적 외교, like groundless religious diplomacy and craze.
Or we could just say a cult. But yeah, that's essentially what the Democratic Party accused the Yoon administration of being.
Right, and once there is actually a Korean version of FARA, Foreign Agent Registration Act, something like this could be very easily be a target.
And if you want to know more, listen to last week's episode.
And if you have any comments, again, leave a review on any platforms where you are listening to this podcast episode. If you have any topic suggestions, send it to podcast@koreapro.org.
Stay ahead in understanding South Korean politics, business and society with a Korea Pro subscription. Gain access to daily email newsletters, expert briefings and exclusive events designed for professionals like you. As a podcast listener, you can now try Korea Pro for free and subscribe at a discounted rate if you like what we're doing. Equip yourself with the insights that matter most. Visit koreapro.org/podcast to subscribe and ensure you never miss a critical update. Korea Pro, never be sidelined again.
Week ahead, there was an ambassador appointment, pending hearing, that we have been waiting for months and months and months, which is ambassador to Australia, potentially Shim Seung-seop.
Okay, so you wrote the profile on Shim about a month-ish ago. Could you explain to us what or who he is? What did he do before?
He's actually very interesting. The context here, of course, is that after the marine death investigation issues had former ambassador and former defense minister Lee Jong-sub, he resigned, right?
After serving as ambassador for less than a month.
Right, and so the South Korean government was sort of in a tough position on like who to tap really, because like it has to be someone of a high-ish profile at the level of minister or adjacent.
Right, you can't appoint a minister one day and then send a nobody bureaucrat
Right, because
the next.
that's also a political messaging. Like we care about Australia this much, sort of, you know.
And South Korea does care about Australia.
Right, and for good reason, because defense exports and security cooperation, and because of that, they had to find someone former military, and
Okay.
it seems like they did find him. Shim is actually recognized quite positively in South Korean progressives and conservatives, and
Which is rare.
very, very rare. He gained prominence notably as the first official to report North Korea's attack and sinking of RKS Cheonan to the Joint Chief of Staff while he was serving as head of operations at the time. It was a controversy slightly at the time because it sounded like he downplayed whether or not it was a torpedo or not. But then he explained immediately that, you know, the military's job is to report as soon as possible. That is to the level of what's proven. So
Exactly.
it wasn't right. So that's the only controversy that he sort of had, and which lasted only maybe like a week.
And for a public figure who's only got that one controversy, that's as clean as they come.
Before he retired, he was promoted to admiral and the 33rd chief of naval operations in 2018, I believe. And then after retiring, he became the special advisor on national defense and security for People Power Party presidential election committee for Yoon. So he goes way back, helping Yoon out with the defense and arms export policy. And also he studied defense engineering as well. So his resume, his CV looks perfect for the job, but he will still go through hearings, so keep an eye on it. It will happen in the next few weeks.
Well, that's one down, but there's also another thing that we heard about the First Lady. This is an endless saga.
Endless saga that might end soon, I hope.
Finally.
Yeah, with systematic changes. Finally, the Yoon administration the presidential office staff actually mentioned this, that they are reviewing structural changes that would allow the First Lady office to come back.
After they abolished it.
Right, abolishing it and also trying to revive it. It's a complicated saga. But at the end of the day, it seems like there is, like, for different reasons, the opposition party and the ruling party sort of has a consensus, and even the progressive papers and conservative papers, they all sort of agree that this was needed and it's too late, but it's good that it's happening. So I will be writing about this, so keep an eye on it.
And if you would like to know more about this, all of this information will be coming into your inboxes on Monday at 2 p.m., so please subscribe.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for tuning in.
If you want to know more, sign up for our daily executive briefings. We brief you on all you need to know from the past 24 hours and why they matter every morning in your inboxes.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for your weekly dose of insight. And until next time, I'm Jeongmin Kim.
And I'm John Lei. Stay connected, stay informed, and we'll see you next time on the Great Pro Podcast.